The signs were always there, literally right in front of my eyes, but I was too blinded by love to notice them. That morning in James's kitchen, as steam rose from our coffee cups, I witnessed another one of their silent exchanges. My future mother-in-law, Eleanor, caught his eye across the granite countertop, and something passed between them, a message coded in subtle movements I couldn't yet decipher. "Don't treat her with indifference," James said suddenly, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. The words hung in the air, seemingly disconnected from our pleasant breakfast conversation about wedding preparations. Eleanor's lips twitched slightly, and her head tilted at an odd angle. I felt that familiar discomfort crawl up my spine, the one that always surfaced when they shared these peculiar moments. I was a successful interpreter by profession, fluent in 5 languages, but this silent dialogue between mother and son remained frustratingly opaque to me. 3 years into our relationship, and 6 months away from our wedding, these wordless conversations had become more frequent, more intense. Sometimes I'd catch Eleanor's fingers dancing against her teacup, or James's shoulder shifting in response, followed by decisions or comments that seemed to come from nowhere. That morning marked a turning point, as I watched Eleanor's perfectly manicured nails tap a rhythm on the counter. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Something clicked in my mind. My years of studying nonverbal communication patterns in different cultures hadn't been wasted. There was a system here, a language hidden in plain sight. I made my decision right there, between sips of rapidly cooling coffee. I would decode their silent language, not out of mere curiosity, but because something in James's warning to his mother sent chills down my spine. Don't treat her with indifference. Was he protecting me? Or was it something else entirely? The next few weeks became my covert research project. I started cataloging every gesture, every slight movement, recording them in a notebook I kept hidden in my desk at work. Eleanor's weekly dinner invitations, which I'd once viewed as a future mother-in-law's enthusiasm, became my field study sessions. I observed how James's jaw would clench in specific patterns, how Eleanor's fingers would tap out rhythms that seemed random but never truly were. What I didn't realize then was that my decision to crack their code would unravel not just their secret language, but the entire fabric of what I thought was my perfect life. The first breakthrough came during a Sunday brunch, 3 weeks into my investigation. Eleanor's hand moved in that familiar pattern, tap, tap, pause, tap, and for the first time I caught the meaning. She suspects. My blood ran cold as James's response, a slight shift of his coffee cup and a twitch of his left eyebrow, became clear as day. Impossible. But they were wrong. I didn't just suspect. I was beginning to understand. And what I would discover in the coming weeks would force me to question everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the man I was about to marry. Little did I know that my professional skills as an interpreter would become my salvation, unraveling a web of deception that had been silently weaving itself around me for years. The magnitude of what I was about to uncover would shake the foundations of not just my relationship, but my entire understanding of human connection and betrayal. As I left their house that Sunday, Eleanor's parting gesture, a fluid movement of her wrist combined with a specific tilt of her head, stayed with me. It would take me another week to decode its chilling meaning. She must never know the truth about the others. The others? What others? The question echoed in my mind as I drove home, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I was standing on the edge of a precipice, and I knew that once I took the plunge into their world of silent signals, there would be no turning back. But I had to know. I had to understand what was being planned and discussed right in front of me, in this language of secrets and shadows. My breakthrough came faster than expected, though not in a way I could have anticipated. As a professional interpreter, I knew that understanding context was crucial. Every language has its patterns, its rhythms, its tells. The key to cracking James and Eleanor's code lay in the repetition of certain gestures during specific topics of conversation. I started bringing my laptop to our family gatherings, pretending to work on wedding planning spreadsheets while secretly documenting their movements in a detailed chart. 3 finger taps meant urgency. A clockwise wrist rotation followed by a shoulder drop signaled disagreement. The slight head tilt to the left combined with a blink pattern spelled out warning. But it was during a seemingly innocent dinner party that I caught my first glimpse of the darkness lurking beneath their silent exchanges. Eleanor had invited several of James's ex-girlfriends, something that had always struck me as odd, but that I dismissed as her attempt to maintain friendly relationships. That evening, watching through my newly educated eyes, I saw the truth unfold in their gestures. When Sarah, his college girlfriend, arrived, Eleanor's fingers drummed a specific pattern on her wine glass. James responded with a subtle neck movement and eye shift that I now understood meant, "She's still useful." My stomach churned as I pretended to be engrossed in my salad. Throughout the evening, similar exchanges occurred with each ex-girlfriend, Rebecca, Michelle, and Lauren. Each time, the message was clear. These women weren't just past relationships. They were current assets in whatever game James and his mother were playing. I excused myself to the bathroom, hands trembling as I pulled out my phone to document what I'd witnessed. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was more disturbing than anything I could have imagined. These women weren't just maintaining social connections. They were part of an elaborate network. But for what purpose? The answer came through Eleanor's next dinner party invitation. This time, I arrived early, intentionally catching them off guard. As I walked into the kitchen, their rapid-fire gesture exchange froze mid-sequence. But I'd seen enough. Eleanor's hands had been moving in the pattern I'd learned meant transfer complete, while James's response indicated account secured. My professional background in financial translation kicked in. These weren't just social gatherings, they were business meetings disguised as friendly dinners. Each ex-girlfriend represented a different account, a different transaction. But why maintain these connections? Why the elaborate charade? I spent the next week diving deeper into my investigation, using my lunch breaks to do something I'd never done before: background checks on James's exes. What I found sent shivers down my spine. Each woman had experienced a sudden financial windfall shortly after their relationship with James ended. Inheritances from distant relatives, unexpected business successes, lucky investment returns, all traceable to offshore accounts, all following suspiciously similar patterns. But it was what I discovered about Eleanor that truly shook me. Before her marriage to James's father, she'd been investigated for running a sophisticated investment scheme in 3 different states. The cases had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but the pattern was clear. Now, decades later, she had refined her approach, using her son's romantic relationships as a cover for something much more sinister. The next family dinner, I watched them with new eyes. Every gesture took on a darker meaning. When Eleanor's fingers tapped out, "She's perfect for the Singapore account," I felt my heart stop. James's response, a subtle combination of shoulder and hand movements, translated to, "after the wedding." I was to be their next mark. That night, as James slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing. The wedding invitations had already been sent, the deposits paid, my dress hanging in my closet like a white flag of surrender. But beneath the surface of our perfect engagement lay a truth that threatened to destroy not just our future, but potentially the lives of everyone involved. What they didn't know was that my skills as an interpreter went far beyond just understanding their code. Years of working with international financial documents had given me insights into exactly the kind of operation they were running. I had contacts in the banking industry, connections that could help me understand the full scope of their scheme. But as I watched James's chest rise and fall in the darkness, I faced the hardest question of all. What would I do with this knowledge? Confronting them directly could be dangerous. Their elaborate communication system suggested a level of sophistication that wouldn't take kindly to exposure. Yet the thought of playing along, of becoming another pawn in their game, made me physically ill. I needed proof, concrete evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. And I needed a plan, one that would protect not just me, but potentially all the women who had fallen into their trap. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thing was clear. The next few weeks would require every skill I'd ever learned, both as an interpreter and as a survivor. The first red flag I should have noticed wasn't their secret language. It was the way James had pursued me from the beginning. Working as a financial interpreter at Global Securities wasn't just my job, it was my passion. I had access to international banking networks, understood complex financial regulations, and maintained connections with banking officials across Asia. In short, I was the perfect target. I started documenting everything, converting their gestural language into a detailed log. During another family dinner, I watched Eleanor's hands move in what I now recognized as their discussion of the Singapore account. James's response made my blood run cold. She's already arranged the transfers for after the ceremony. That night, I made my first counter-move. Using my work credentials, I began a discreet investigation into the financial histories of James's exes. Sarah, his college girlfriend, had received a mysterious inheritance from a previously unknown great-aunt in Switzerland, 3 months after their breakup. The aunt, I discovered, didn't exist, but the money was very real. $5 million, routed through a series of shell companies. Rebecca's story was similar, a sudden windfall from a successful investment that coincided with her split from James. Michelle had won an unexpected settlement from a business dispute that never appeared in any court records. Lauren had received a substantial grant for her art gallery from a foundation that, upon closer inspection, led back to one of Eleanor's shell companies. I needed to be careful. If they suspected I was investigating, their silent warnings could become something far more dangerous. I maintained my role as the excited bride-to-be, attending cake tastings and venue tours while secretly building my case. My years of experience in interpreting financial documents became my shield, allowing me to spot patterns that others might miss. The breakthrough came during a routine evening at their house. Eleanor had left her tablet unlocked while preparing dinner. As she and James engaged in their silent conversation in the kitchen, I glimpsed an email notification. Transfer confirmation, Singaporean Holdings Limited. The same company name I'd traced in Sarah's inheritance transaction. I began working late at my office, using my security clearance to access international banking databases. The pattern was staggering. Each of James's ex-girlfriends had been used to move money through a complex network of offshore accounts. Eleanor was the architect, James the charming facilitator, and I was meant to be their biggest conquest yet. But they had made one crucial mistake. They hadn't accounted for my skill set. As an interpreter, I wasn't just trained in languages. I was trained to notice patterns, to understand cultural nuances, to see connections that others might miss. Their nonverbal code wasn't just a way to communicate. It was a paper trail of their intentions. During another family dinner, I watched Eleanor's subtle finger movements with new understanding. The wedding venue deposit will be perfect for the initial transfer. James's response, a combination of eye movements and shoulder shifts, confirmed, she suspects nothing. I felt sick to my stomach, but maintained my composure. Years of professional interpretation had taught me how to keep a neutral expression while processing disturbing information. That skill was now saving my life. What they didn't realize was that I had already begun setting my own trap. I had reached out to Sarah, carefully arranging a coffee meeting that appeared coincidental. Her initial reluctance to discuss James spoke volumes, but as I shared my observations about their gestural language, her facade cracked. "You've noticed it too?" she whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched her coffee cup. I thought I was going crazy, the way they would communicate right in front of me. And then she trailed off, fear evident in her eyes. That conversation confirmed my worst suspicions and provided my first ally. Sarah had been keeping her own records, too afraid to come forward alone, but ready to act with support. Together, we began reaching out to the others, Rebecca, Michelle, Lauren, building a network of our own. Each woman's story added another piece to the puzzle. The pattern was always the same, a whirlwind romance with James, increasing involvement with Eleanor, subtle pressure to share financial information, and then a sudden breakup followed by an unexpected windfall that came with strings attached. But my situation was different. My position at Global Securities made me valuable enough for them to plan a wedding, to invest months in the long game. The stakes were higher, and so were the risks. As I pieced together their scheme, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every woman they had manipulated and every woman they might target in the future. That night, as I reviewed my growing file of evidence, James called to discuss wedding details. His voice was warm, loving, completely at odds with what I now knew about him. "Mom's so excited about the ceremony," he said. "She's been working on something special for us." "I bet she has," I thought, watching my computer screen as another transaction alert popped up from one of their shell companies. The pieces were falling into place, but I needed to be patient. One wrong move, one premature confrontation, and everything could fall apart. The wedding was 2 months away, and I had to play my part perfectly until then. The hardest part wasn't decoding their silent language anymore. It was maintaining my own performance. Every morning I woke up next to James, kissed him goodbye, and pretended I didn't know he was orchestrating my financial ruin. Every evening, I sat across from Eleanor at dinner parties, smiling as her fingers tapped out messages about which of my accounts they planned to target first. Sarah had become my closest ally in this investigation. We met regularly at a small cafe 3 towns over, far from James and Eleanor's usual haunts. "They've been watching my accounts again," she confided during one of our meetings. "Eleanor's foundation made another charitable donation to my gallery last week. I had to accept it to avoid suspicion, but..." Her hands trembled as she showed me the transfer notification on her phone. I was building a detailed case, but I needed more. Through Sarah, I managed to arrange a seemingly casual lunch with Rebecca and Lauren. Michelle joined us via video call from Chicago, where she'd fled after realizing the true nature of her investment returns. Each woman's story added another layer to the scheme. "James always insisted on joint accounts," Rebecca explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said it was about trust and building a future together. Then Eleanor would start showing up at the bank with us, making suggestions about international investments." Lauren nodded, twisting her napkin. "The gallery grant came with so many strings attached. They have ways of keeping you quiet, making you feel complicit. The money looks legitimate on paper, but if anyone started asking questions, the pattern was clear. James would romance them. Eleanor would integrate herself into their financial decisions. And together they would manipulate their victims into positions where speaking out became impossible. But they'd never encountered someone who could decode their private language, someone who understood the intricacies of international finance as well as they did. One evening, during another family dinner, I watched Eleanor's hands move in what I now recognized as their most ambitious plan yet. The Singapore merger will be our biggest yet. After the wedding, her position at Global Securities. Her fingers stilled as she noticed me watching. For a fraction of a second, I saw fear flicker across her perfectly composed face. I maintained my naive smile, but inside, my heart was racing. They were planning to use my professional connections, my reputation, to facilitate their largest scheme yet. The wedding wasn't just a commitment ceremony, it was a business merger, and I was the unwitting CEO about to sign away everything. That night, I made a crucial mistake. While James was in the shower, I received an encrypted email from Sarah containing new evidence. I was so engrossed in the documents that I didn't hear the water stop. James walked into our home office just as I was closing the laptop. "Working late again?" His tone was casual, but his hands moved in that familiar pattern, a question to Eleanor who wasn't even present. I realized with horror that they had a surveillance system in place. His movements were being recorded, transmitted somehow. "Just finishing up some translation work," I replied, forcing a yawn. But as I stood to leave the room, I noticed his shoulder tick, the signal for verify. The next day, Eleanor invited me to lunch, just the two of us. It was the first time she'd ever made such a request. As we sat in an upscale restaurant, her fingers danced across the tablecloth in patterns I now understood perfectly. "We may need to accelerate our timeline." I felt the walls closing in. They were suspicious, perhaps not of the full extent of my knowledge, but enough to consider me a potential threat. I needed to act faster, but rushing could destroy months of careful investigation. The evidence I'd gathered was substantial, but not yet conclusive enough to ensure their scheme would be fully exposed. That afternoon, I received a text from Sarah. "They're asking questions about you. Be careful." Shortly after, James called to suggest moving the wedding date up. "Why wait?" he said cheerfully. "Mom's already done most of the planning." I agreed enthusiastically, knowing that every day mattered now. My files were growing, the network of victims was expanding, and I was close to uncovering the full scope of their operation. But as I ended the call, I caught my reflection in my office window. The fear in my eyes was becoming harder to hide. That evening, as I reviewed my evidence one more time, I realized I had overlooked something crucial in their pattern. Each of James's previous relationships had ended abruptly, usually after a significant financial milestone. What if the wedding wasn't their end game? What if it was just the beginning of something much worse? I made my move 3 weeks before the newly scheduled wedding date. The catalyst was a gesture I caught Eleanor making when she thought I was absorbed in cake tasting. Once she's gone, her network becomes ours. James's response chilled me. Clean break, like the others. My position at Global Securities became my sanctuary. I had already quietly transferred my most sensitive files to a secure server, documentation of every transaction pattern I'd uncovered. The evidence was damning. Shell companies, falsified inheritance claims, manipulated investment returns, all connected to Eleanor's foundation and James's string of broken engagements. Sarah's gallery became our command center after hours. We gathered there one night. Sarah, Rebecca, Lauren, and Michelle via encrypted video call. Each woman brought her own pieces of the puzzle. Bank statements, suspicious transfers, threatening emails from Eleanor's foundation. They're getting sloppy, Michelle reported from Chicago. The last transfer they tried to push through my accounts triggered an automated alert. They're rushing something big. Lauren nodded, spreading out her gallery's financial records. The foundation tried to move another grant through last week. When I delayed signing the paperwork, Eleanor showed up at my door the next morning. I shared my latest discovery, evidence that Eleanor's foundation was preparing for a massive transfer, timed to coincide with my wedding day. The amount made everyone gasp. $50 million, routed through a complex network of accounts that only someone with my security clearance could authorize. That's when Rebecca revealed something that changed everything. James was married before, she whispered, before any of us. Her name was Diana Chen. She worked at a bank in Singapore. My blood ran cold. Diana Chen, the name had appeared in my research, but I'd dismissed it as another business contact. Now, searching through Singapore's financial records, I found the truth. Diana had died in what was ruled a suicide, 2 days after flagging suspicious transactions from Eleanor's foundation. I thought I'd been careful, but I'd underestimated their reach. That night, returning home, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked along our street. My phone began acting strangely, calls dropping, messages delayed. They were watching me, just as they'd watched Diana. James became more insistent about wedding preparations, his gestures to Eleanor increasingly urgent. Everything must be perfect. But I caught the underlying message in their silent exchanges. No loose ends this time. I set my plan in motion. First, I contacted an old colleague at Interpol's Financial Crimes Division, someone I'd worked with on international fraud cases. Then, I reached out to Diana's family in Singapore, using a secure line from my office. What I learned from Diana's sister confirmed my worst fears. Diana had discovered Eleanor's scheme, just as I had. But she'd confronted them directly, thinking her position at the bank would protect her. She didn't understand that their network reached into the highest levels of financial institutions. I wouldn't make the same mistake. The evidence I'd gathered went to 3 separate secure locations. If anything happened to me, it would trigger automatic notifications to financial regulators in 5 countries. The next family dinner became a dangerous dance. Eleanor's fingers tapped out instructions about the Singapore accounts, while I pretended to fuss over flower arrangements. James kept touching my shoulder, a gesture I now recognized as reassurance to his mother. She suspects nothing, but their confidence was their weakness. They believed their silent language made them invincible, never imagining that someone could crack their code. As Eleanor detailed their plans for the wedding day transfers, I was recording every gesture, every movement, building the final pieces of evidence we needed. Sarah called late that night, her voice trembling. "They're closing in. Eleanor's foundation just filed paperwork to absorb my gallery." I assured her our countermoves were in place, but I heard the fear in her voice. We were all walking a tightrope now. The next morning, I made my final preparations. The wedding was a week away, and Eleanor had insisted on a private dinner. Just the three of us. As I dressed for what I knew would be our last family gathering, I touched the recording device hidden in my necklace. Everything hinged on tonight, on capturing their silent confession in a way that would stand up in court. What they didn't know was that while they'd been watching me, others had been watching them. The trap was set, but one wrong move would spell disaster. As I drove to Eleanor's house, Diana's fate weighed heavily on my mind. I had to be smarter, more careful, more strategic than she had been. Tonight, their silent language would finally speak volumes. Eleanor's dining room had always felt like a stage, but tonight the air was thick with unspoken tension. The elaborate table setting, the carefully selected wine, the soft classical music, all part of their performance. I watched Eleanor's hands move as she served the appetizers. Everything is prepared for next week. James squeezed my hand under the table. His thumb tracing patterns I now understood meant, trust us completely. The irony wasn't lost on me. My necklace felt heavy, its hidden recording device capturing every gesture, every movement. In my purse, my phone was silently streaming our location to Sarah, who waited with our assembled evidence at a secure location. I've been thinking about Diana Chen, I said casually, taking a sip of wine. The reaction was instant. Eleanor's hand froze mid-air, and James's shoulder twitched in their warning signal. I pretended not to notice, continuing. She worked at United Global in Singapore, didn't she? Such a tragedy about her suicide. Their silent exchange was frantic now. Eleanor's fingers danced across her napkin. She knows. James's response was subtle but clear. Impossible to prove. The wedding venue you chose, I pressed on. It's beautiful. Right next to the marina where Diana was found. I kept my voice light, conversational, even as I saw James's hand move in what I now knew was their signal for immediate action. Eleanor's smile remained fixed, but her gestures screamed panic. We need to end this now. James's response was a barely perceptible nod. I felt his hand move toward his pocket, where I knew he kept his phone. One call would set their contingency plan in motion, the same plan they'd used on Diana. But I was ready. Before you make that call, James, I said quietly, you should know that everything you're signaling to your mother right now is being recorded and translated. Every gesture, every movement. I can read them all. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's hands went still, and James's face drained of color. I pulled out my phone, displaying the app I'd developed with Sarah's tech team, a real-time translation of their gestural language playing across the screen. Fascinating system you've developed, I continued, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. Using subtle movements to discuss your plans right in front of your victims. Very efficient. Until someone cracks the code. Eleanor recovered first, her hands moving rapidly. She's bluffing. But I translated her gestures out loud, watching their faces pale further. Then I began reciting their previous conversations. Dates, times, exact gestures, and their meanings. Every discussion about the Singapore accounts, every plan for the wedding day transfers, every mention of their previous victims. Diana figured it out too, didn't she? I said, watching Eleanor's hands tremble. But she confronted you directly. Amateur move for someone in financial crimes. She didn't understand the depth of your network. James started to stand, but I raised my hand. I wouldn't. The evidence is already with Interpol's Financial Crimes Division. Sarah, Rebecca, Lauren, Michelle. They're all working with investigators right now. Everything triggers if I don't check in every hour. Eleanor's mask finally cracked. Her hands moved in desperate patterns. We can negotiate. I translated this aloud too, watching her face contort with rage and fear. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice hard. You're both going to sit there while I call in the team that's been waiting outside. Then you're going to explain exactly what happened to Diana Chen. And then you're going to return every dollar you've stolen from every woman you've targeted. James tried one last time, his hands moving in what he thought was their unbreakable code. You'll never prove it. I smiled, touching my necklace. I already have. I'm an interpreter, remember? And everything you've just signaled is admissible evidence. The sound of cars pulling up outside broke the tension. Eleanor's hands moved one last time, a desperate plea for escape. But as federal agents flooded into the dining room, I saw something I'd never seen before. Both mother and son completely, utterly silent. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of statements and depositions. I watched from behind one-way glass as Eleanor's perfectly manicured hands moved in increasingly desperate patterns, trying to signal to James in separate interrogation rooms. But their silent language had lost its power. Every gesture was now evidence against them. Diana Chen's sister flew in from Singapore, bringing with her a stack of her sister's journals. Reading them was like looking into a mirror. Diana had documented the same patterns, the same subtle movements, the same growing suspicion, but she'd confronted them alone, thinking her position would protect her. The journal entries stopped abruptly, 3 days before her death. She knew, her sister told me, hands clutching Diana's final journal. She tried to warn others, but they made her sound unstable. The bank directors, the police. Everyone believed Eleanor's version of events. She paused, wiping tears. Until now. The investigation revealed the full scope of their operation. Eleanor had perfected her scheme over decades, using James's charm to target women in finance. Each victim was carefully selected, groomed, and then systematically stripped of assets through a complex web of fraudulent transactions. My wedding would have been their masterpiece, a way to access Global Securities International networks. Sarah organized a meeting at her gallery, now free from Eleanor's foundation's control. All the women gathered, some in person, others via secure video call. As federal agents compiled evidence from our combined testimonies, I watched these strong, successful women begin to reclaim their narratives. I thought I was crazy, Rebecca admitted, her voice stronger now. The way they could communicate right in front of me, making decisions about my life without saying a word. When I tried to tell my friends, they said I was being paranoid. Lauren nodded, spreading out the gallery's new, clean financial records. They didn't just take our money. They took our trust, our confidence, our ability to believe in ourselves. Making us think we were imagining things was part of their strategy. Michelle's face on the screen showed relief as she announced her return from Chicago. The authorities have frozen all the foundation's assets. They're tracking down every fraudulent transfer, every fake inheritance, every manipulated investment. The evidence I'd gathered proved crucial. My recordings of their gestural language, combined with financial records and testimony from their previous victims, created an airtight case. Eleanor's carefully constructed empire was crumbling, and with it, the power she'd held over so many lives. James attempted to cut a deal, offering to testify against his mother in exchange for leniency. But their silent language betrayed them one final time. I caught their attempted coordination during cross-questioning, providing prosecutors with even more evidence of their collusion. Diana's case was reopened. The mysterious circumstances of her death, once dismissed as suicide, were now being investigated as a potential homicide. Eleanor's network of influence, which had once protected them, was now being exposed and dismantled. 1 month after the arrest, I stood in my empty apartment, packing away the last traces of my life with James. The wedding dress still hung in its garment bag, a symbol of how close I'd come to becoming another victim in their scheme. But as I took it down, I felt only strength. I'd turned their weapon, their secret language, against them, and in doing so, had given voice to all the women they'd tried to silence. The doorbell rang. Sarah, Rebecca, and Lauren had arrived to help me move. As I opened the door, I saw in their faces the same determination that had helped us bring down Eleanor's empire. We weren't just survivors of a sophisticated fraud scheme. We were the women who had decoded their silent language and spoken the truth out loud. "Ready?" Sarah asked, picking up a box. I took one last look at the apartment where I'd almost lost everything, but instead had found my greatest strength. "Ready," I replied, closing the door on that chapter of my life. That evening, as we sat in Sarah's gallery celebrating our victory, I received a message from Diana's sister. The Singapore authorities had found new evidence in Diana's case. Eleanor and James would face additional charges. Justice, so long silenced, was finally finding its voice. 6 months after Eleanor and James's arrest, I found myself standing before a room full of financial professionals at an international banking conference. My presentation, Decoding Financial Fraud, the Silent Language of Deception, had drawn hundreds of attendees. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using my interpreter skills in ways I'd never imagined. The most sophisticated predators don't use force, I explained to the attentive audience. They use trust, intimacy, and subtle manipulation. They make you doubt your own perceptions until you can't distinguish reality from their carefully crafted illusion. The evidence from Eleanor and James's case had exposed a pattern spanning 2 decades. 17 women across 3 continents had been targeted. The total amount stolen exceeded $100 million. But the financial losses were just the beginning. The emotional toll, the shattered confidence, the years of self-doubt had left deeper scars. During the trial, Eleanor maintained her composure until I took the stand. As I translated their recorded gestures for the court, demonstrating how they had discussed their victims right in front of them, her facade finally cracked. Her hands moved frantically, trying to signal to James. But now everyone could read their silent language of deception. James received 15 years for his role in the scheme. Eleanor, given her history and the mounting evidence in Diana's death, faced a longer sentence. The judge was particularly moved by the testimony of their victims, accomplished women who had been systematically targeted and gaslighted. Diana's case brought justice too late for her, but her sister found peace in knowing the truth. The investigation revealed that Diana had compiled extensive evidence against Eleanor and James. They had silenced her before she could expose them, but her death ultimately contributed to their downfall. My work took on new meaning. Global Securities promoted me to head of their fraud prevention division, where I developed programs to help financial institutions recognize similar schemes. The gestural language analysis techniques I'd created became part of international banking security protocols. Sarah's Gallery hosted our support group meetings. Women from around the world contacted us, sharing stories of similar experiences. We created a network dedicated to helping potential victims recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation disguised as romance. Watch for the patterns, I advised during counseling sessions. Trust your instincts. If someone seems to be communicating in ways you can't quite understand, if decisions are being made without your full awareness, step back and document everything. Rebecca started a consulting firm specializing in protecting women's financial interests during relationships. Lauren's Gallery became a center for advocacy art, highlighting stories of survival and empowerment. Michelle returned to Chicago to establish a legal aid organization for victims of financial abuse. The money they had stolen was gradually recovered. Eleanor's extensive network of shell companies and hidden accounts was dismantled, each discovery leading to the return of funds to their rightful owners. But the real victory was in restoring these women's trust in themselves. One evening, as I finished a counseling session with a new group member, she asked me a question that struck deep. How did you find the courage to face them alone? I wasn't alone, I replied, thinking of Sarah, Rebecca, Lauren, Michelle, and Diana's sister. None of us were ever really alone. They just made us feel that way. Their power lay in isolation, making each of us think we were crazy, paranoid, or oversensitive. But when we came together, when we shared our stories and combined our evidence, their silent language lost its power. As I drove home that night, I thought about the wedding dress I'd donated to a women's shelter. They'd sold it and used the money to fund their financial literacy program. It felt right, transforming a symbol of deception into a tool for empowerment. My phone buzzed with a message from Diana's sister. She'd started a similar support group in Singapore, using the materials we'd developed. Our network was growing, creating a safety net for women who might otherwise fall prey to sophisticated predators like Eleanor and James. A year had passed since the trial when I received an unexpected email from one of Eleanor's earliest victims. Catherine Torres had read about our case and recognized the pattern from her own experience 25 years ago. She'd lost everything to Eleanor's scheme back when James was just a teenager learning his mother's silent language. I never thought I'd see justice, she wrote. I'd convinced myself it was all my fault. I invited her to speak at our next support group meeting. As Catherine shared her story, I watched the faces of other survivors, each recognizing pieces of their own experience in hers. Eleanor's conviction had opened floodgates of testimony spanning decades. The trial had revealed something none of us expected. James wasn't Eleanor's first partner. Her own husband, James's father, had been her original accomplice until his mysterious disappearance 30 years ago. The investigation into his case was ongoing, adding another layer to Eleanor's web of deception. In prison, Eleanor made one final attempt to maintain control. She tried to use her silent language during supervised visits with James, but the gestures we'd documented were now part of the prison's security protocol. Their secret world had become their cage. James showed signs of breaking free from his mother's influence. During his last appeal, he finally spoke the truth about Diana's death. His testimony provided closure for her family and led to additional charges against Eleanor. It wouldn't reduce his sentence, but it marked the first time he'd chosen truth over loyalty to his mother. The documentary about our case premiered at an international film festival. Silent Signals followed the stories of Eleanor's victims, highlighting how financial abuse often hides behind respectability and charm. The film ended with Diana's sister opening a women's financial empowerment center in Singapore, named in her memory. Global Securities implemented new security protocols based on our experience. My department developed training programs to help financial professionals recognize subtle signs of coercion and manipulation. Banks around the world adopted our guidelines for protecting clients from relationship-based fraud. Sarah's Gallery hosted an exhibition called Breaking the Silence, featuring works by survivors of financial abuse. Lauren contributed a powerful installation, security camera footage showing Eleanor and James's silent exchanges, overlaid with their translated meanings. The evidence that had convicted them became art that could warn others. Rebecca's consulting firm expanded internationally, specializing in helping women secure their financial independence. Michelle's legal aid organization won landmark cases that strengthened protections against financial exploitation. Our network of survivors became a powerful force for change in the financial industry. One morning, I found a letter from James in my office mail. Prison had aged him, but his handwriting was steady as he explained how Eleanor had trained him from childhood, using their silent language to isolate him from normal relationships. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote. "I'm finally learning to speak for myself." The letter went into my files, along with the others. Each piece of evidence, each survivor's story, each small victory against financial abuse helped illuminate the dark corners where predators like Eleanor operated. Our work wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about prevention, education, and empowerment. During my last counseling session of the year, a young banker sought my advice about suspicious patterns she'd noticed with a wealthy client. As I helped her document the warning signs, I realized how far we'd come. The silent language that Eleanor and James had used to deceive had become a tool for protection, its patterns now serving as warnings rather than weapons. Diana's journal sits on my desk, a reminder of the woman who first tried to expose Eleanor's scheme. Next to it stands a photo from the opening of Diana's sister's empowerment center, surrounded by the women who helped bring Eleanor and James to justice. We're all smiling, but our eyes hold the wisdom of survivors who've reclaimed their voices. The silent language of deception had been decoded, but more importantly, we'd created a new language of solidarity and strength. In the end, that was our greatest victory, transforming a tool of isolation into a bridge that connected survivors, empowered victims, and protected future generations from similar schemes. Eleanor's empire of silence had fallen, but from its ruins, we built something louder than words, a network of voices that would never be silenced again.